Teachers of Reddit, what red flags have you seen in your students? Story 1. I'm a technology teacher. Design and make. I had an 11-year-old student who was terrible at using scissors and couldn't thread a needle. She had very high grades academically, but something didn't seem quite right. I recommended she receive special assistance and a referral, and it turns out after testing that she had very little spatial awareness and almost no hand-eye coordination. After calling the parents, we found that her mother was paralyzed and in a wheelchair. Only dad had come to parent interviews, etc., and dad was very busy working to support them both, so no one had ever played any physical games or activities with her. She hadn't developed in this area and was intelligent enough to hide these shortcomings in previous school activities. Not a difficult fix, lots of time doing crafts, but something that could have really held her back in the future. Story 2. My aunt is a teacher. She worked at a school where there were many low-income students. She was teaching a class of first graders a few years ago, and there was a little boy who would frequently ask to go to the restroom. After a while, she got suspicious that the kid either had a physical problem or was trying to get out of doing schoolwork. She sent the boy to the nurse. The nurse said that he was fine and was probably faking it to get out of class. She told the little boy that he wasn't allowed to go to the restroom anymore. This made him upset. The kid started yelling when she didn't let him go to the restroom. She called the parents in for a conference. The little boy fessed up in front of his parents about why he kept wanting to go to the restroom. Apparently, this family was so poor that they didn't even have a toilet in their home. The boy said that he would go to flush the toilet and watch the water whirl. The kid was fascinated by a toilet flush. Really made me appreciate the little things. Story 3. My mom was a second grade teacher and had a little boy in her class that would go full red rum and draw crazy things on his dry erase board. He would write things like finish with images of dead classmates. Upon asking the student why he was writing these things, he just replied with, "She's telling me too." The scariest part was, the boy was absolutely terrified. He didn't want to write or draw any of these things, but felt obligated by this woman. My mom recommended him for a psych eval, and it turns out he had severe schizophrenia. I dated a woman who was a school shrink, and she told me a story like that. She saw a kid who was kicked out of class for some reason, and he would randomly get distracted while she was asking him questions. She said, "Did someone just say something to you?" He said, "Can you hear her too?" Story 4. I had a teacher tell us, the entire classroom, that she doesn't send letters or notes home regarding a student's behavior because she once had a student come back the next day with bruises. Said, I had something similar to this happen when I was in grade 10, except the teacher caught me in the hallway and asked why I skipped the class that day. And I showed him the bruises and other stuff from my stepdad on my arms and ribs. I think I had broken cracked ribs 4 times that year or something stupid like that. And after that, he offered to stay later after school with me every day. So all my work for his class, science. I am horrible at science. Stayed within the classroom, and he was always exempted from any and all homework for the rest of that semester. And he never sent my mom and stepdad any emails after that either. I ended up passing the class at least. The teacher was also very young. I think he was 23 or 25 at most. It was so strange to me because no other teacher tried to help, even if I asked for extra help. They told me homework was for home, and that is the end of this conversation. That science teacher also got a lot of crap from other students. Like, a lot of crap. I'm thankful he helped me, though. I have no clue if he had done that for anyone else. I was always the only one there after school with him. Story 5. I worked in an elementary school for a few years, and there was this kid I swore was a sociopath. He was very smart and manipulative, but he also gave me the creeps. He would often find ways to hurt kids by getting other children to do his dirty work. He was so good at spinning this manipulative web of lies that the children would blame each other, leaving him completely out of it. Even when he was caught red-handed, which wasn't often, he would deny it. For whatever reason, the principal had a soft spot for him, so he never got in trouble for anything that he did, and the principal saw him as the victim. I won't be surprised in the slightest if I see that kid in the news someday for hurting people in some way. Story 6. My mom worked at my elementary school during and after my stay there. She worked as a teacher's aide and would help out during lunch. While I was in middle school, she told me about a little girl who came to lunch every day with a crummy, squished sandwich and nothing else to eat. Her brother, on the other hand, would get a more acceptable lunch. She said that the first few times they noticed it, they would offer milk and fruit to her, but the brother would just take it away from her. so they had to start waiting for him to finish his own lunch and go outside for recess before they could feed her. I don't know what happened with her after that, though, but I felt so much anger at that snot-nosed brat. What the heck was wrong with that family that even the brother was putting down that little girl? Edit. Wow, seriously. I was young when my mom told me this story, so I don't remember all the details, but for those of you saying why they didn't stop the brother would tell the mother that they were helping the girl, and she would just get even more worse off from it. That girl was in the worst position to be in. Basically, he would take the food and tell mommy the adults were giving sister food, and she would come in the next day with absolutely nothing, not even the crummy squish sandwich. As well, I don't know how the story ended, and really I don't think I even want to know. I just like to think that my mom and the other teachers were able to do something nice to a sweet little girl in her crap life, and that they got her to know that someone does care. Story 7. I work in an inner-city school in an under-resourced neighborhood. There are so many red flags every week, I couldn't count them all. One little boy stands out to me, though. I greet the kids as they come into school every morning, and one day I noticed a man and a child walking across the lawn to our door slowly, the man getting in the child's face a few times. Finally, they reach the door, and the man practically hands his son to me, saying, "Can you make sure he gets to his classroom? He just tried running away from me a minute ago." I was speechless, but I took the kid, who was quietly tearful, and brought him into the building. I was trying to ask him whose class he was in so I could take him to his room, but he wouldn't talk to me. Finally, he said, "I don't want to go home ever again," just as I was getting him through the door, and another teacher stepped in and swept him away, telling him, "We haven't seen you in weeks. Don't cry, we don't do that here." I know she meant well, but I could tell that it had taken a lot for that kid to say what he did, and I didn't know if he would share that with anyone else. I told the school social worker and can only hope that he's being taken care of now. That boy broke my heart. Story 8. As an early years teacher, the worst thing I've seen is a child trying to hump others. For example, a child bends over, he walks up behind and thrusts into them. He gets on top of a child and proceeds to hump them, generally walking up behind them and weirdly thrusting his pelvis into others, pinning children down or into corners and doing this. Sweet kid, but that behavior rang alarm bells. I reported it on 3 separate occasions before a report was taken from me, and it went, supposedly, further up the chain. Always suspected his sister was in fact a young mom, as the mother was nowhere to be seen. I met her twice in 2 years of caring for him. Story 9, a bit different from some of the others, but I once taught a class of 30 at-risk 4th graders. They were getting supplementary math lessons, as they were failing their regular math class, and it was rough. It was one of those schools where they have metal detectors at every entrance. On multiple occasions, I broke up rather impressive fights. Without conventional weapons, they were really ingenious. One kid once ripped out the 3-ring part of the 3-ring binders and attacked another student's forearm with it. Really creative, but obviously not great behavior. I was an untrained and unqualified teacher. I was supposed to be designing the after-school program curriculum, not teaching. I actually completely missed the red flag. One kid, I'll call him Darren, was really well behaved. I never had to say anything to get him to sit down, stop hitting other students, stop throwing things, or any of a number of disruptive activities going on in the classroom. In fact, he never did much at all. He spent most of the time dozing off or barely listening, leaning forward and resting his head in his hands. I didn't think anything of it. As the rest of the class was so disruptive and destructive, I was spending most of my time and energy just keeping them under control. Well, Darren was quiet and sleepy during class, because his house burned down at the start of the school year. The fire ended his grandma, who raised him, and his dog. He was sent to live with his cousins, 12 people who lived in a very small house with nowhere close to enough bedrooms to be legally occupied the way it was. Darren had been depressed and having problems sleeping, sharing a room with his cousins, for the entire year by the time I found out what happened. I learned on the last day of school. "I'm sorry I didn't know, Darren. I'm sorry I didn't notice you were having problems." Story 10. I've been a teacher for a lot of middle schools and elementary schools as well. Anyway, there was one young man who changed my life on what I thought humanly possible to go through. Dayon was his name, and since this was during the big Deion Sanders hype, he was picked on a lot for basically looking like the opposite of the athletic NFL star. Deion was one of the sweetest kids I met. He was a little overweight for his age, 12 years old, 230 pounds, but it seemed as the school year progressed, he also seemed to look gradually thinner. It was odd most of the time. You never see those crazy transformations from fat to skinny, unless you teach at high school. I remember asking him one day after about 3 months of noticing what was going on, and I decided to finally act on what I was feeling. We got talking, and I finally asked him, "So, Dion, how have you lost all this weight?" I tried my best not to make it awkward, but as he started telling me how he had done it, I realized it wasn't his decision. I half thought before he was going to say something along the lines of, "I just can't handle the bullying," or "I hate it when they make fun of me." That was not the case. His mother had him on a diet of only celery ever since he first went home and complained about the bullying. He explained how every night his mother would weigh him, and if he didn't make the weight goal for that week, she would punish him. It was severe. Anytime he didn't make it, his mother would tie his arms to one end of the bed and each of his legs tied to each corner on the opposite side of the bed. Then she would begin punching him 2 times in the gut and one kick to his genitals until he threw up. Gosh, I just remember listening to all this and I couldn't believe it. I knew his mother from PTA events. She was strict and demanding, but it still all seemed out of character. Then Dion lifted his shirt, showing the dark purple bruise marks all over his stomach. She ended up going to jail not too long after Dion and I had our conversation. Dion ended up being one of my favorite students, and we still talk today. He is actually a student teaching in my class as we speak. Story 11. Had a high school student who was a well-known white supremacist wear a bulletproof vest to school one day. Quietly called the administration to come take him from class. His father complained, "Where in the dress code does it say he can't wear a bulletproof vest?" That was a big red flag. Later that year, the kid was expelled for extorting money from other kids by threatening them with a screwdriver. A year later, that student got shot in the face and lost his entire nose, and he's now in prison. Story 12. I had a student ask me if I had any old glasses frames she could have, because hers broke. I knew she was in the foster care system, so I asked her why her foster mom couldn't get her some new ones. She told me that her foster mom said she could only get new frames every 4 years, which made her sad because her real daughter had just gotten a second set of frames that year. I had noticed several other things. The student asked me if I had any extra feminine hygiene supplies so she could have some at night. So I sent her to the nurse to get extras. That seemed like they should have been covered by the state. I reported this, and it turned out that the foster mom was clearly not providing basic necessities for either of her foster kids. I was really glad I went with my gut. Story 13. I have a 7th grade student this year who bugged the hell out of me. He was that kid. He smelled bad, was disrespectful and disruptive, and generally made life miserable for us. Then we found out about his background. At a young age, his mother tried to finish him several times. She got drunk and chased him with a knife, and he only escaped by locking himself into the bathroom. She tried to drown him. She used to put out cigarettes on him. Currently, he lives with his alcoholic father, who obviously hates the kid. He told me the other day that he spent the weekend going to AA meetings with both of his parents. I've made it a point to be kind to him now. I take a minute every day to talk with him and praise every positive action I see. I hope to make school something positive for him because I can only imagine the hell he goes home to. Story 14. This isn't exactly a red flag so much as a full-on explosion, but I'll never forget the lessons I learned. I used to run a camp at a zoo. We had some scholarship kids, and their home life seemed pretty rough. I also drove the van to go get them sometimes. I had this one kid in particular who was really tough to deal with. Bigger than the other kids by a fair margin, had lots of anger issues, etc. 2 stories about him. We'll call him. Jay. So the first story was that I witnessed him haul off and smack this other kid that he knew. They were both in the same program and even lived in the same complex. I took him aside to have a chat with him and asked him, "Jay, what's a better way you could have dealt with that?" I was thinking, walk away, go tell an adult, etc. He literally couldn't think of a single thing other than to just hit her. Made me realize that's probably just how things are resolved in his home. Still makes me sad. The second story was that I worked with him the first day of camp and struggled with him in my group. I found myself being pretty controlling/discipline focused with him because I just couldn't handle him otherwise. So I decided to try him in another group with a male leader, figured maybe that would go better. So the second day, he was with our male leader. That didn't go well either. The third day of camp, I tried him with our remaining leader, and I don't think he even lasted the day. So I took him aside and asked him to pick who he wanted to spend the rest of the week with. I figured he wouldn't pick me because I had been so hard on him earlier in the week, but I wanted to give this kid at least one decision he got to make himself. Lo and behold, he picked me. The rest of camp wasn't a cakewalk, but we managed. I've never forgotten him. Story 15 hours I was grading papers, and one of my students was exhibiting all the red flags that she intended to harm herself in the paper. She had turned it in days previously, and I had seen her looking down that morning, so I rushed her paper down to our school psychiatrist. She moved to pull the student out of class, but she had ditched school halfway through the day. Police were dispatched and caught her literally seconds before she carried out her plan. Thank God I didn't put off grading another day. Story 16. Had a kid I taught in preschool who would get unreasonably angry, violent, and loud for no obvious reason. Everything would be fine, and then he would totally snap. All we could do when he did was to usher other kids away and wait for him to calm down. His mom seemed nice enough when I met her, and his dad didn't appear to be in the picture. He never showed up, was never discussed by mom or child, etc. One day, mom didn't show up to pick him up. I was the only teacher left since he was the last kid, and he just sat at the window sobbing. She didn't show up until 7 p.m. that night, and our building closed at 5:30 p.m. By that time, he was completely inconsolable, and it was all I could do to run down to the kitchen with him, make him a sandwich with the director's permission, and let him watch movies on my phone. Over the course of the next few weeks, this started to happen more, and no matter how many times the director talked to his mom, she would continue to come late. Then his lunches started to deteriorate, and he would come to school hungry, having not been fed breakfast. He was only with us for the 3 months between preschool and kindergarten, and I have no idea what happened to him. But the director was paying close attention, and luckily, we never saw any physical abuse. I always brought him breakfast and made sure I had an extra sandwich and Capri Sun for him when I came to work. That kid didn't go hungry on my watch. Poor kid was just being forgotten.
Story 1. Over the winter break of my freshman year, I was diagnosed with a degenerative bone disease in my knees, which meant I had to use crutches for a while, then eventually a wheelchair for a time. I was late to my Philosophy 101 class, due to adjusting to my newfound limitations. I apologized for my tardiness and tried to find my seat without making a fuss. As I was making my way across the room, my philosophy teacher remarked, "Everyone, let's just patiently wait for the cripple here to get to his seat." It's possible she had believed I was one of the several skiing injuries that the student body had incurred over winter break. But either way, after that first day, I never came back to that class. Story 2. Was a freshman in college, needed to get some science credits with the lab. Took geology because I wanted to try something besides bio that I just took in high school. The teacher gave a speech the first day of class about how it gets under her skin that people take geology because they're required to take a lab and just assume that it'll be an easy A. So she said, "This class will not be an easy A," and then proceeded to make it hard as hell. Like, make it challenging so people will be engaged, but make it nigh impossible to pass just to prove a point. Story 3. I took an economics course and bombed the first test. I went to the professor and told her, "I really want to do well in your class. What are some suggestions you might have on how I can be successful?" She looked at the grade on the test and said, "You should drop the class and change your major. I may be bad at economics, but I can follow instructions." Something similar happened to me too. I bombed my first calc test, and when I went to the TA asking what I could do to at least pass, he told me, "Nothing, just drop. You'll never pass with a score like that." I was even like, "Can I come to your office hours?" And he said no, just drop, and walked away. I didn't because I'm stubborn and got help from my engineering buddies, and ended up with a B thanks to the curve. Story 4. These books are required for the class. I wasn't able to get the revision into the bookstore in time, so the only place you can get them is from me directly or from my website. I will warn you, if you don't buy the books, you won't get the login information to be able to take the final, which is 90% of your grade. Oh, and no, I can't accept financial aid for them, but it's only $250, so it's not a big deal. I had never seen an entire class get up 5 minutes in and leave before. Story 5. I had a professor that in hindsight I really should have dropped. It was a Western civilization history class, And the first day, the entirety of the class he spent talking about how he missed his old job teaching in Europe, because American students are more lazy and incapable of getting as high of grades. Then he showed intro YouTube videos from his personal laptop hooked up to a projector, and all of the recommended videos all had titles like Grinding with Thong, College Babe Grinding, etc. I thought he was just eccentric, but the guy was easily the worst teacher I ever had. He would expect you to totally memorize all the chapters. He would quiz on material that didn't matter for concepts, i.e., what was the name of Caesar's second cousin? When the information would be found in a huge family tree, the only students in the class with A's were women, and he would grade their quizzes differently and be much more lenient. The students compared quiz results. Someone in class called him out, and he said that he was tired of teaching Americans and he doesn't get paid enough. Literally. Story 6. Pride in the difficulty of their course. If everyone fails, it's not for an inability to learn, but for an inability to teach. I had a French professor like this. She gave us so much homework that I had a couple of hours a night of French homework and 3 other classes that were more important to my major. She handed back the homework the first week and dropped the bombshell on us that she was marking us down for any mistakes that she saw we had already erased and corrected ourselves on. Even if the final answer was the correct one, she marked it as if we'd turned in the wrong answer if she could see eraser marks. This wasn't some advanced class, this was French 1. I wasn't in the first wave to drop. Finally, it was between barely scraping by this class and passing my biochem class. So I dropped, but too late to get a refund. She bragged every time someone dropped and ridiculed students who answered incorrectly. It was a really toxic learning environment. Story 7. When the teacher doesn't even explain anything. He just goes on YouTube and shows the class a video, and everyone is left without a clue of what is going on. I dropped computer science because of this, and I'm glad that I did. Also, when the teacher hardly ever explains anything and insists on independent research. More like, I can't be asked to prepare lessons, so just go ahead and do it yourself. Story 8. Back when I started college, I got straight A's in a class, but when I went to check on my overall grade, I had a B+. I found it odd and went to question my teacher about it. He said that he dropped down my grade because the class was a bit of a pain in the butt. He didn't use those exact words, but that's what he meant. Then I questioned him again about my posture, asking if I did anything wrong, or disturbed class, or whatever. He promptly said I didn't, and that I was a great student, which made me ask again, why is my grade lower then? He said the same excuse from above. Then I asked if he was planning on changing my grade at all, since I had only A's. And he promptly said he wasn't going to change it. Fast forward a few days, I ended up filing a complaint about him and his method of grading students, and the college made him change my grade. After that, he approached me and said something like, "Hey, you didn't have to file a complaint about me, I was going to fix your grade, yada yada." Story 9. The instructor either seems to have trouble speaking in the language in which the class is being taught, or their accent is so thick that it's difficult to understand them. While plenty of people are incredibly knowledgeable about their topic of interest without being great at multiple languages, the fact of the matter is that you're not going to learn much if you're going to have to devote so much of your attention into just figuring out what the instructor is saying. Story 10. I've had teachers that I just simply couldn't understand due to a language barrier, and in hindsight, I should have dropped immediately. I learned that basically, if you can't understand what the teacher is saying, be prepared to teach yourself a lot of the class. I had an accounting teacher one time who was Chinese, and I remember sitting in that class on the first day scratching my head because I had no idea what she was saying. I looked around, and a lot of the other people had the same look on their faces. The next week, I showed up to class, and what was once a classroom of about 40 people was now about 12. I should have known right there to drop, but I didn't. I stuck it out, and a few weeks went by, and it didn't get any better. I got my first test back and completely bombed it. I told myself right then that I was going to have to teach myself the material, and that coming to class was pointless. So I taught myself accounting by using the textbook. Since I didn't go to class, I missed all of her pop quizzes, but just told myself I'll make it up on the tests. I only showed up for tests and the final, and lo and behold, I passed the class. Story 11. No one will get an A in this course because insert some philosophical highbrow bullcrap answer. Yeah, I had a professor that spewed the idea of once you stop trying to earn an A, you can actually learn something. Which I understand in concept, but when his exam averages were under 30% and most of his students were trying to get into grad school, earning that A is just as important as actually learning the material. Hated every second of that semester. Story 12. Saw a course at my college called Digital Media and American Culture. Sounds neat, I thought. I'll go to a lecture during the shopping period. The professor is 10 minutes late, an 80-year-old man who gets up and literally asks a student in the front to tell him how many Facebook friends she has, and then how many real friends do you have. Was flabbergasted when he asked if anyone in the classroom had read 1984, and most of the class raised their hands. He was 100% convinced that millennials never pick up books anymore. Story 13. The opposite. Purchasing the book for this class will not be necessary. Save your money. I have a PDF copy if anyone needs it, but we will follow along together, and I have printouts of all the questions. When a teacher does this, I'm like, okay, they obviously care about making this a good experience and not wasting my time or money. Or if they tell you the best way to get a textbook, we've got 5 copies in the library. Don't buy the book, you get it free with my math lab. Most of the stories we will read are public domain. The translations may differ when you quote other sources, so make sure you include the translator in the source. Story 14. I once had a professor say, "You get 2 absences this semester. More than 2 and you fail. It doesn't matter what the excuse is." Sorry, with older relatives who were sick and dying, and not being a psychic myself to know whether or not I'd get sick, or if I'd forget to set an alarm, or any number of unforeseeable things. That level of rigidity and unwillingness to compromise is not worth it. I had a class where we were allowed 3 absences. I got bronchitis and used them up about midway through the semester. But towards the end of the semester, I got a concussion from passing out during an asthma attack, and I wasn't allowed to look at screens, read, listen to music, draw, exercise. This included my 1.5-mile walk to campus, or think too hard for a week and a half. When I was able to go back to class, I brought him the paperwork from the hospital, but he just told me, read the syllabus, and wouldn't even look at my medical papers, saying that I wasn't allowed to go to class. My grade went from an A+ to a B-. And the thing was, it was a lecture hall with 200 students, so it's not like there was any group participation or anything. And it was a 100-level class, mostly for freshmen. Story 15. Definitely one of the biggest things you need to consider is that even if there's a large workload, depending on the subject, it may help. You have to remember that the professor also has to grade this stuff, so assuming there's no TA doing all of the grading, it's extra work for him. I know it's not what you want to hear, but take for example my physical chemistry professor. He assigned 1 to 2 homework assignments per week, and they took anywhere from 3 to 6 hours on average to finish. It sucked, but instead of guessing on exams, I fully understood the material. This professor was always answering emails as well, within an hour at almost any time of the day. If they have crappy response times, they probably won't be that helpful, and I'd recommend dropping. The most helpful professors I've had were the ones that answered emails. Story 16. I've gotten my entire degree taking online classes from the University of Houston, and there are 2 things that scream drop this class. You are required to log on to Blackboard at least 3 days a week. I didn't register for an online class because I've got ample hours in my day to log on and do schoolwork. I take online classes because I have the ability to successfully complete weeks' worth of work in one day. You are required to use a lockdown browser for exams and have your webcam on, and you must give me a tour of the entire room with the camera, and the volume must be on, and it must be during normal working hours. Nah, no one invades my privacy, and my normal working hours are 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. Not much I can do about taking an exam before 5 p.m. Story 17. A professor who is clearly off his meds. Over the course of my 1 month in the class, he was constantly rude and unbelievably condescending to literally everyone. Example, we were in a section talking about multiple sclerosis and how it signals misfire from the brain. A student said, "My cousin has MS," and said this is how he was told what was happening. Is that correct? Professor gets red in the face and yells, "I don't care about your cousin with MS," and proceeds to rant about how interrupting him with stupid questions is a waste of his time. He never answered the question. During the second week, less than half the class showed up, or at least a noticeable chunk. He yelled at us that did show up about how disrespectful it was, then said we would have to learn this section on our own, and that we would be heavily tested on it, then stormed out of class. There was no participation mark in the class. Also, he stated at the beginning of the semester that more than 50% of students dropped his course. Our grades consisted of a 40% midterm and a 60% final. I took the midterm before dropping the class. It was the hardest test I have ever taken in my life. He expected us to answer questions that we had not been taught. When confronted, he said, "You should always be applying the course material to future study." Class average was 15%. The highest mark was 68%. The next highest was 32%. He doesn't scale. Want to complain? Talk to the head of the department. Surprise! He is the head of the department. Head of the department can only be held for 2 years. He managed to hold it for 4 due to a loophole or something. No department head wanted to upset him, probably. Yes, he had been required by the university to take meds to keep his job. I don't think he ever actually took them. Story 18. When I was 18, I took a beauty therapy and science class. One of the units we had was business studies. I had previously sat an A-level in business, so I still had notes and books left over. We didn't have the usual business teacher because she was signed off sick. Cancer, I believe. So instead of getting a qualified teacher, the department brought in a beauty salon manager who was a cow. Knew nothing about teaching, but thought she knew everything about business. First class we have, she's doing the introduce yourself thing. Then she asks, "Who in this class is a Leo?" I raised my hand, and it's only me. "Oh, because in my star signs I always clash with Leos. I'm sorry." Okay, so now we have a crazy cow. The class is in a stunned silence as I simply say, "Okay, cool." The time came to write the assignment for the class, and me being savvy, I used my old business class notes and books and handed it in with the biggest smile on my face. Results day. Everyone passes with high marks, all except me. She has me in front of my head tutor for plagiarism, and she's clearly copied and pasted all of this from the internet. My head tutor explained that I had sat an A-level in business, so I should know what I was talking about. My head tutor remarked my paper and passed it with a high merit. I later told her about what was said, regarding the star signs, and how I felt attacked due to some insignificant fact about my birth sign. Next lesson, she announces she's leaving due to her teaching methods being questioned and having a complaint, whilst glaring at me. The rest of the class was relieved. Story 19. If they treat the class like a high school class. Had a professor proclaim no cell phones or she would take them away. Attendance was mandatory, and if you are not going to be in class without telling her, she will assume you're lazy and fail you. For some reason, she hated me on day 1, which was weird. I was motivated to get a good grade to bump my overall GPA up. I just needed a D- for my degree requirement. Sat up front, took detailed notes, left my cell phone face down like the professor requested. However, no matter what, I could never get above 70% on anything. About halfway through the class, I noticed the bias because my friend just copied all my crap and always got 15% higher. I went to her office hours and pointed this out. She flat out looked at me and said, "You're a lazy POS. I can see it. I don't want to see you pass. You have an attitude in my class. However, you showed up here, so I'll keep a better eye on you and see if I'm wrong." My grades slowly started to go up after that. Still, never reaching my friends though. Then I made the biggest mistake. I decided to tell her I would miss the next class to pick up my bro from the airport, who I haven't seen in 7 years. She threw a fit, yelling at me in front of the whole class on how I was a nobody and I wouldn't amount to anything, and no matter what, I would never get a good grade with my attitude. I later learned that she always picked someone at random in every single one of her classes and made their crap miserable only to give them C minuses, so they would need to retake the class if it was required to get better than a C. Story 20. Had some issues with my schedule and wasn't registered for a particular course on the first day of class. So I registered and attended on the second day. He had already paired up the class into groups of 3 to 4 on day 1 for a project that would span the entire course and count for a large part of our grade. When I asked if I could be joined into a smaller group, he told me no, that I could do the work solo for the semester. I was peeved, but needed that course as a prerequisite for something I needed to take next semester, so I silently fumed. After week 2, I had failed 2 reports because he just didn't like what I wrote. Not that the reasoning, research, or writing was unsound, he just didn't like the subject, so he gave me failing grades. I dropped the class, took it with another teacher the next semester, and graduated a semester late because of it. I don't regret it. He was a horrible teacher, and I'm sure my mental health would have suffered if I had continued in his class. Story 21. A red flag that the teacher has a really bad ego problem is if they require you to buy their books, especially if they only recommend books they've written. Yes, you are the only person who has ever written about James Baldwin. No one else has anything remotely worth adding to the conversation. Also, using your students as a means of increasing your sales numbers and making more money is a crappy, egotistical thing to do.